Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today for talking about how we talk about gender, understanding gender by examining language, presented by Dr. Randi Shedlosky-Shoemaker. This talk is the second in the Lenses of Gender series, which will continue each day through Friday this week. And these lunchtime talks are part of the Center for Community Engagement's 2021-22 program series, Understanding Gender, which also includes two exhibitions. The Glass Ceiling, which was curated by Ophelia Chambliss, is a series of paintings, stories, testimonials, and spoken and written word pieces by women that addresses the issues of realizing, reaching, and breaking the glass ceiling to success in their careers and personal lives. This exhibition is currently on view at the Center for Community Engagement building in downtown York through May 31st. We also have Engendered, which features work by artists addressing gender identity in a variety of ways that include examining their own relationship to established gender norms and expectations, responding to the heteronormative male-female binary, and asserting queerness as a fluid alternative to the idea of stable gender identity. This exhibition is on view at our Market View Arts building through May 21st. So now I'd like to introduce our presenter for today. Dr. Randi Shedlosky-Shoemaker earned their doctorate in social psychology from Ohio State University in 2010. Their doctoral work looked at the use of and effect of narratives on people's attitudes and behaviors. They started teaching in the psychology program at York College of Pennsylvania in 2011. Since that time, they have taught general psychology, multicultural awareness, psychological perspectives of intimate relationships, critical thinking, reading, and writing in psychology, and senior capstone in psychology. Their current research focuses on matters related to social identity, inclusivity, equity, and accessibility. And so Randi, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Rebecca. I'm fine if people want to ask questions, by the way, as we go along. I have the chat up, so I will try and pay attention to the chat if you just want to shoot a quick chat. Or like Rebecca said, I have tried to save time at the end, and I'll watch the clock too, to make sure that we save at least 20 minutes at the end for questions and any discussion. I started teaching multicultural awareness. I want to say that was maybe about 6 or 7 years ago. And one of the first essays I had my students read in that class, this was actually had been assigned by a previous instructor, and so I just continued using their materials. But in reading this essay, one of the quotes that really has always stuck with me in relation to gender is this quote by Lorber, talking about gender for most people is the equivalent of fish talking about water. And I'd have a discussion with my students, like, what does Lorber mean by this? Inevitably, students would kind of recognize that gender is just all around us. It's so part of our nature that we don't think about it. And because of that, I think it can be hard to reflect on what gender means for us. But we actually have quite an opportunity to think about gender by thinking about how we talk about gender. And that's because language really does matter. So language, the connection between language and thoughts is what we call in psychology a bidirectional loop. They each affect one another. So language can cause thoughts and thoughts can cause language. Language is important to us because it is a social and cognitive tool. So it's a social tool in the sense that it allows us to interact with one another. We can't beam our thoughts into other people's heads yet, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. And so we rely instead on language to get our thoughts out there for the world and for us to understand where other people are coming from, to understand their thought processes. So this is where language is a sociocultural tool. It's also a cognitive tool. And what I mean about that, or by that, is the idea that we cannot actually directly observe someone's thought processes. And this is really important in the psychology field because that's part of what we study, human behavior and thought processes. But if I can't directly get at thought processes, I'm going to need a mechanism by which I can indirectly get at thoughts. And that's where language becomes a window to our thoughts. So I often invite students in the multicultural class to really think about the language we use, whether it's gender or any other social category like race or age, disabilities, disorders, because in thinking about our language, we have an opportunity to examine how we personally think about a topic, as well as how society thinks about a topic. The other value in looking at language is that whether we intend for it to happen or not, language will convey our values. So language is a persuasive tool, and it is important to appreciate. Certainly you can understand we intentionally choose our words sometimes to shape people's attitudes and beliefs, but sometimes we don't have intention. We do it quite accidentally. So if we look at some different words here, if I call someone assertive, so if I'm describing someone as assertive, I'm probably trying to convince you they're a pretty good person. But if I don't like the person, I'm probably not going to say assertive. Instead, I'm more likely to use something like pushy. Stubborn, no, tenacious would be the positive one. Stubborn is usually a more negative one. Someone who is cooperative, that's a positive thing, but from a negative standpoint, I might call them a pushover. So these words that demonstrate either positive or negative value of a trait tells us that we are trying to use language in a way that will shape people's attitudes and behaviors. And again, sometimes we do that quite accidentally. Another reason language is important is the fact that it is learned. We indeed are born with a biological capacity to learn language. And in fact, we are born with some basic language skills. And when I say basic language skills, we are born with the ability in most cases to make noise or make sounds. So sounds are the basic unit of language, but it's actually our environment that kind of takes this lump of clay that we are and molds us into whatever the environment wants to see. So it doesn't matter that we all kind of start with the same universal basic noises and are prepared to make those noises. The culture, the environment we are in will shape how those noises are used and how those noises become, in fact, language. Finally, it's important to reflect on language because it evolves over time. I said earlier, language is a socio-cultural and cognitive tool. And like any tool, devices, techniques that we used 100 years ago, they're not the ones we use now. In fact, even devices and techniques that we used 10 years ago are not the ones that we use today. Something like language, any aspect of culture, is created by people. And as people change, they're going to change all of their cultural tools, including language. So it's important to recognize, I'm going to try and talk a little bit today about gender inclusive language and give some suggestions, but know that language will always be changing. There's a correct answer maybe that works for today, but that's not necessarily going to be the correct answer for the rest of all time. So language, and really the study of language, is kind of this continuous effort to learn and to invest ourselves into exploring our thought processes through language. All right, so with that in mind, as far as why language matters, we're first going to consider how our gender-related language specifically helps us understand how we think about biology. Now, I do want to point out in this slide, I'm going to interchangeably use the idea of biological sex and gender. And I do appreciate there is indeed a difference. So biological sex, people usually use it to refer specifically to genitalia, specifically to having certain reproductive organs, whereas gender is more the psychological experience of masculinity and femininity. But the fact of the matter is, even though gender is that psychological experience, it was derived from biological origins. And I think understanding where gender came from does help us appreciate how we have thought about biology. So for gender, we're talking about usually an assumption made about someone's reproductive contribution. Gender is usually assigned at birth based on the appearance of genitalia. And we usually kind of assume that there's two options. And the reason people will argue for these two options is from the assumption that, well, we need male and female for sexual production. But really, it turns out that that's not true for all organisms. I'd also like to point out that that way of thinking about gender really tells us something very interesting about humans and how we have thought about people's contributions to society. Because if we think about, okay, what does it mean to be a female or male from a reproductive standpoint? It's really said to us that people have tried to divide humans into seed receivers and seed senders, for lack of better terms. There are also people that argue that no, it's not just about reproduction, that there's genetic makeup dictates our gender. Though it is worth understanding that even there, we have tried to oversimplify genetics and tried to suggest that there are two options when it comes to our sex gene. Now, typically, people will present with a sex gene of 2 chromosomes. And if you have an XX, you are designated as female. And if you have an XY, you are designated as male. In reality, there's more than 2 options. So the typical, like I said, is to have the 2 chromosomes. But it is possible that some people will have 3 chromosomes or even have 4 chromosomes. And oftentimes how we use our language is to suggest that anything where the Y is absent is designated as female. So we've boiled down kind of 3 possible options into one specific category with our language. And anything where the Y is present, we designate as male. In a lot of these cases, people will say, well, XXX, the XXY, the XYY, this is where something has gone wrong. Though in most of those cases, if I have 3 chromosomes, there's often no apparent issue other than maybe problems with reproduction, maybe growth-related issues. But actually, a lot of times if people have 3 sex chromosomes, it's not even detected, so it's very difficult to diagnose. The exception is actually when you have 4. So the idea that there's only 2 options, I mean, in reality, we've got 5 options that seemingly don't cause any problems for people beyond having the 4 chromosomes, which they do find sometimes associated with mild intellectual or psychological symptoms. Another area that becomes problematic when we have tried to categorize gender as 2 options based on biology is actually when we come to talk about intersex people. Now, how the field treats intersex currently, it's designated as a disorder. And I think that's important to understand. That's the language we use. A disorder suggests that somehow it is deviant from the norm. But disorder also tends to suggest that there is distress and dysfunction, some level of potential danger that can be done to that person when they have this disorder. We don't necessarily see that with intersex. The danger of using the word disorder and qualifying something like being intersex as a disorder is that then it justifies or is used to support biological interventions. And people argue the reason for this intervention is to fix. And I think that's a meaningful word that society uses when we're talking about people who are intersex, that we are trying to fix them, we're trying to help, but in reality, we're trying to make them fit this potentially oversimplified biology of biological sex or gender. So this is what our language about gender so far can tell us about how we think about biology. But what about beyond biology? I do want to point out on several of the next slides, I do have this QR code in case you want to check this out. This QR code will take you to the guidelines from United Nations on gender inclusivity. They have some tips on how to use more gender inclusive language. They have it not only in English, because I'll be sharing some tips in English, as that is my primary language, but they also have tips for Arabic, Chinese, English, oh, I said English already, French, Russian, and Spanish. And as we go, I'm going to have some language in, or some font in purple. Those are going to be tips on inclusive language. So you can be watching for those. So what we can learn about gender looking at language. First of all, there's actually no universal consistency. So despite this assumption that gender is biologically based, so some folks will want to assume that gender is about biology. You would think then humans tend to be fairly biologically universal. We do not have a universal consistency in how we talk and thus how we think about gender. In fact, this kind of assumption that we have a two-gender model, this was really pushed through European colonization and cultural imperialism. Because if we look at a lot of pre-colonial or non-European cultures, they are more likely to acknowledge two genders. The most common, by the way, is to acknowledge 3. There's some that acknowledge 4. It tends to vary a lot. In terms of a lot of the genderized or gender-based languages, we do see that dichotomy of feminine or masculine come out. So some examples of that in language. The use of she or he pronouns. If you're looking, by the way, for nice gender inclusive pronoun, more and more professional organizations are moving to allowing they or encouraging the use of they if we're talking about a single person where gender is unknown, or in a situation where gender is irrelevant. So they does allow us to have a pronoun that avoids that gender dichotomy of feminine or masculine. Another example where we see this dichotomy come out, I understand, and I feel a little bit bad. I come from the North, I'm originally from Wisconsin. We really did not use ma'am and sir often where I came from. I know a lot of folks now who are from the South, and ma'am and sir are more common for them. So not trying to pick on my Southern friends here. But if we look at the idea, what is intended to be a polite title, ma'am or sir, it does require us to make assumptions about the person we are talking about. And it does require us to kind of boil down a person that we may not know to an either or sort of scenario. So despite the intent of trying to be polite, language like ma'am and sir does create that dichotomy of women or men. We even see it in terms of some of our roles. So I was a waitress. That was one of my first jobs. And it's kind of interesting because I often refer to myself as a waitress. I was so embedded in using that language. Actually, when coming up with this talk, I was like, we have these roles, waitress versus waiter. I'm like, what is the gender inclusive sort of option here? And suddenly it just occurred to me, I'm like, okay, well, it's the person who serves your food. The server, there you go. You call them the server. So you don't have to necessarily assume someone's gender. What's interesting about the ma'am versus sir and the talking about like your waitress or your waiter is, again, you are talking about someone you probably don't know. You probably don't know what their pronouns are. Maybe you didn't ask, maybe they didn't tell you. I feel like a lot of times when I would walk up to a table, that would not be one of the first things as I'm trying to introduce myself to my clients and give them the menu. We don't reveal our pronouns. And so we are having to make assumptions about someone that we know very little about and assume their gender. Another issue we start seeing as we kind of pick apart our language is that masculine, what is masculine, really is given a primary position in our society. So what that means, if we look at a lot of gendered language, the feminine version of a word is often derived from the masculine version. For instance, hostess comes from the masculine version, host. So we kind of start with the masculine and modify to make something feminine. We also see this in terms of treating masculine as the default. So if I'm looking at, for instance, mixed gendered groups, this is actually one of my biggest pet peeves as someone who works on a campus. We call them freshmen. They are first-year students. The difference here, first-year students, is avoiding that masculine as a default, whereas freshmen, you would use this term if I was talking about a group of first-year male students, and yet we easily use it if I'm talking about a group of mixed gender first-year students, kind of masking or obscuring any feminine presence whatsoever. We also do this when we're making comparisons. So using phrases like compared to men, kind of setting men up as the default. Women are whatever claim I'm trying to make. So we do often kind of put the masculine in our language first. We see this too a lot in terms of masculine words showing up before feminine words. And this was actually something I realized I had to go back through my slides, and I was like surprised actually how often I naturally did this. And it kind of showed me how much this has been socialized into how I use language, that I say things like men and women at work, by the way, instead of saying things like employees, which would be gender inclusive. Oftentimes the masculine group was coming first. Research does show there is kind of one exception to it, and it's really sort of interesting where that exception occurs at home. And even there, I started thinking about how often I say mom and dad, and when I flip it and say dad and mom, it almost sounds weird to me, so that I'm so socialized to kind of see mom first, or what is feminine first, when I'm talking about the family or when I'm talking about home. Now, in terms of talking about women versus men, again, we see some differences, some really interesting differences in terms of language for work-related descriptions. So if I'm writing a letter of recommendation or an employee evaluation, which I'd really like to emphasize here, letters of recommendation, employee evaluations, these have real-world consequences. You know, they can affect if someone's going to get hired, if someone's going to be promoted, they affect what salary someone might be offered. What's interesting in these discrepancies we see is women, if I'm describing positive qualities, oftentimes we describe them in very concrete ways. But if I'm describing something negative, I will describe it in a more abstract way. For example, a negative concrete would be saying, I earned a bad grade in history. So it's got context. It's very specific to say, I earned a bad grade in history. But if I say, I struggled academically, that's more abstract. Now, the reason this matters, if I'm talking about the negative in an abstract way, it can be really easy for a reader to be like, oh, that negative quality will generalize throughout, as compared to if I'm talking about something in a very concrete way, like the positive qualities in this case. It's very specific. It's very contextualized. It's nice. People can imagine it. So concrete's useful there. But people might not be as inclined to generalize that positive quality will show up in other instances. We also see for women descriptions in their letters of recommendation, descriptions in their employee evaluations tend to use more communal or more social adjectives. So describing women as kind, compassionate, caring. If we compare this to how men are often described, first of all, we reverse what we saw with the concrete and abstract. So now positive qualities are being described in a very abstract way so that it makes it easier for us to generalize those positive qualities. Concrete, we use for negative qualities when we're talking about men to try and contextualize and make them very specific, kind of rein them in. We also tend to talk about men using more agentic adjectives. So independent, innovative, brave, courageous, again, kind of usually following along a lot of those gender stereotypes that we have been socialized with. We also tend to have different rules when we're using titles. And this is one of the few areas I could not figure out how to put women first. So the male title comes first in this situation. If I am addressing a man by a title, I have an option, Mr., right? Unless they have some professional title like doctor or professor, I use Mr. But if I'm addressing women and I want to use a polite title, I've got options. I've got Miss, I've got Mrs., I've got Ms. And each of those different options tells us something about that woman and her relationship status. So it's kind of interesting that we tend to use titles and we try to define women by their relationships as well as by their age using these titles. In case you're wondering, by the way, the MX is pronounced mix if you're using that in verbal language. We also see this difference in using titles just when talking about women. This research has actually been done in the media, although I think there's research that also supports this in terms of academia. We're more likely to use first names when talking about women. But when talking about men, we're more likely to use their surname and potentially a title along with that. The difference between that is using someone's first name, it's a more casual, informal sort of moment, kind of suggesting that women don't necessarily deserve or need that due reverence that we just automatically give to men by using their professional title or by addressing them by their last name. What was even interesting to me as I was looking at some of this research in preparation for the talk, I thought back to two professors I had in undergrad, one from psychology, one from communication. I was actually a psychology communication double major. So they were kind of my two academic advisors. One was officially my academic advisor. One was kind of there because I needed someone in psych. How we addressed Dr. Gray. So he was a man identified as masculine. We dropped the doctor, and I say we, many students and I, referred to him as Gray. It was like almost always by his last name. In fact, after I got my doctorate, I've interacted with him since. Referring to him as John is somehow just weird to me. And yet the academic advisor I had, a woman in the communication field, was always Trudy. It was always by her first name. And it seemed like we had a very different sort of relationship because of that language I was using and how I was talking to her, as well as, maybe even talking about her outside of classes. Finally, when we're talking about what we can learn about gender by looking at our language, we can really start to appreciate that we see a lot of our gender roles and a lot of our stereotypes come through in terms of our language. I often spend time talking with my students about phrases like act like a man or man up. So language like this communicates to us that society wants men, expects men to be strong and to be tough, to not be emotional, to not have to process emotions. As I've explained to students, this is actually a really dangerous stereotype. It can kind of sound like a good thing to assume that men are strong, but everyone's got weak moments, right? And if society is always expecting me to be strong, I might not be as prepared to process those weak moments. And this is where we actually see a lot of men struggle with mental health issues because of some of these stereotypes that have been communicated and spread throughout our language. We also have on kind of the flip side, the phrase like a girl. So you run like a girl, you throw like a girl. I don't think anyone has ever used the phrase like a girl to be a good thing. It communicates to us that we do value what is feminine less in our society. We see what is feminine as weak or inferior compared to what is masculine. And what's interesting too, because some students will kind of point to the fact that they're like, wait, but boys get picked on if they try to break gender norms, and girls don't get picked on as much. That is indeed true. Think about the term tomboy. Yeah, it can kind of be used as an insult, but a tomboy, I'm using this to describe a girl who acts a lot like a boy. That's different than the term. There's a different tone to tomboy than sissy, or a term that I might use to if I'm picking on a boy who is acting like a girl. In this way, our language is telling us that it's almost okay. Like, it's not ideal. We'd rather everyone fall in line with their gender role, right? But if you're going to be a girl trying to act more masculine, at least you're trying to act better than your original place in society. But if you're a boy acting like a girl, oh, that's not good. So this sort of difference in insult and kind of degree of insult that we use when talking about people who break from gender roles tells us that we are really not appreciating femininity much in society. We also see this when we start thinking about assuming someone's roles. So if I talk about a nurse or a secretary, it's quite common that even if I don't bring up any pronouns or suggest anything about gender, people will envision or automatically assume this is someone who is a woman. But if I am talking about accountant or contractor, people will assume that these sorts of terms that denote someone who is masculine. I actually found it very amusing. We had some work done on our kitchen a few years ago. We did use a contractor who was a woman. Regularly, I'd be talking with my stepdad about, oh yeah, we're working with the contractor and she decided to do this and blah, 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 blah. And whenever he would communicate back, he would somehow reverse it and be talking about a contractor who is a man. I'm like, it's fascinating how I've even indicated that she's a woman, and kind of this tendency for him to go back in his language and assume contractor equals man. Really tells us how embedded some of those stereotypes become because we have practiced them through language so frequently. So let's kind of wrap up some of our major points, and then we'll have some time. Fortunately, we still have time for discussion. And as I'm wrapping up some of these major points, I want to point out why then some of what I've talked about in terms of how we use language to think about gender, to even construct gender, might be creating some problems for us. So going back to our fish analogy earlier, we were talking about fish talking about water, right? One thing we have figured out so far, how we talk about gender creates this false dichotomy. And it really kind of creates that gender is men or women. This is a situation that's actually really restrictive for all of us because we start narrowly defining what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, and we end up putting putting us as fish in these tiny little bowls where it's not comfortable for us to actually move around, and we can't spread our fins and swim as broadly as we might want to swim. We also hopefully have kind of seen how there's a lot of cases where our language has been part of our socialization that has constructed our understanding of gender. So I really do want to point out, and hopefully as I've talked about, even some of the mistakes and missteps I have made myself, a lot of times when people are kind of misgendering or misunderstanding gender, it's not that we're trying to be bad people. It's not that we're trying to do harm. It tells us that we are so embedded in this language that has created a restrictive system that it's hard for us to imagine. It's hard for us to talk about anything that might be different than that tiny little fishbowl we are swimming around. And it's important to appreciate that as we are socialized to think about gender in specific ways, that creates expectations for us. And our expectations have consequences. We actually call this the self-fulfilling prophecy, the idea that my expectations will impact my actions, and my actions can often shape the outcome in such a way that it confirms my original expectations. For example, if I'm a student who is worried about failing a test, and I'm so confident I'm going to fail this history test. I know it. I know I'm going to fail it. Why bother studying, right? You can kind of appreciate the logic there. If they are so convinced they're going to fail, it does probably seem like a waste of time to study. So I don't study because I expect to fail. Lo and behold, I fail because I did not study, confirming my original expectation. In this way, a lot of our expectations and beliefs about gender or about any other social category become self-perpetuating. And that's problematic because one thing they're perpetuating is gender discrimination. We've seen some of the come through some of the language examples I looked at that quite consistently we see in our language that in society, we are not valuing femininity as much as we are valuing what is seen as masculine. And I want to emphasize, it's not necessarily that saying, we don't value women, we only value men. Remember, there were some of those cases where if men are trying to behave more feminine, they are not seen as valued. So again, this is often about how we value femininity versus masculinity. And additionally, our language becomes a tool, a source for reinforcing a lot of our gender stereotypes. So hopefully I've encouraged some of you, like the flying fish here, to maybe hop out of the water that we're always constantly swimming in and try to look at that water from a different perspective, or look at gender from a different perspective. I know it can be hard. We're not all flying fish, but I do think it's worth trying to kind of be thoughtful about how we construct and use gender, and doing so by looking at our language. So thank you for your attention. Are there any questions? Oh, I'm so impressed with my time. Said I was going to do 20 minutes, and I got 20 minutes for questions. I've got the black box void of Zoom going on.
So if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute your mic and ask, or you can type in the chat if you'd like.
Oh yeah, like Tammy had brought up the campaign hashtag like a girl. I'm gonna forget who did this. I want to say it's Dove, and I'm probably wrong about that. There were some actually really cool commercials that brought attention to how we use that phrase like a girl. And I like kind of this aspect of, potentially trying to take back language. I will say it's really tricky when trying to take back language, because it's always going to have kind of that historical context that's hard to kind of move away from. I know I didn't even bring up, we could have talked about the B word, which I will not be sharing with you. My apologies if you have no idea what I'm talking about. A curse word often used to describe women who perhaps are assertive in society. There's definitely kind of pushes for trying to take back that word, but again, it's tricky because there's so much history of the B word being used to oppress women. So thank you for bringing up that example, Tammy.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering when, like when you're talking to someone who does have a more stringent viewpoint of gender, and like just equates it to biological sex, what kind of tools do you suggest we use to talk to those people and potentially get them to see that gender is not the same as sex?
I think that's a really good question, Ashley. I'm going to say there's no simple tools to do that. So if we think about how we have been socialized to think about gender, I do want people to appreciate we have a lot of experience in seeing gender in a certain narrow way. So trying to sit down in a 5-minute conversation or a 10-minute conversation, or even a week-long conversation with someone, you might be trying to overcome years, decades of socialization to see gender in a certain way. And that can be really hard to break from that habit. Like I said, throughout some of my talk, let's see if I can find some of the examples of my slides. There were definitely some areas in my slides as I went back over, I was like, oh, I am putting men first. Oh, like in this slide, it originally was talking about men versus women. I'm someone who spends a lot of time studying multicultural issues, thinks about the psychological complexities of all of these social categories. And here my socialization was coming out to say, talking about men versus women. I'm like, what is going on here? So I think sometimes having patience with yourself and having patience with that other person to recognize that change is not always quick. I think in terms of tools, I would suggest persistence, always monitoring your language. I've found, for instance, to look at a different social category, if we're talking about the word crazy, or what one of my colleagues calls the C word, I've found that it's actually better than trying to just openly persuade people, like, don't use the C word. Every time they use the C word around me, I correct them. Like I'll just say something, rephrase what they said using a different word. So if they're like, oh, that party was totally crazy. And I'm like, oh, you mean the party was really fun? And I'm just very persistent in doing that, not trying to punish them, but trying to give them kind of a way out for them to say, oh yeah, that I'm not trying to criticize, but it does give them kind of that training experience. So trying to socialize them, I guess, in a different way. In terms of talking about the biology aspect of it, my suggestion there, let's see if I can go back to the biology stuff, is really try to think about, talking with them and asking questions to try and understand why they are so invested as gender as a biological variable alone. And just trying to see, why do they see gender as just about reproduction? Why do they see gender as just about genetic makeup, but they don't necessarily see other aspects of our identity in that way? So trying to understand where they're coming from. Sometimes when people are in a position of having to explain their beliefs, when they don't have a good foundation for why they have those beliefs, they start seeing some of the holes in their own argument. and they might kind of slowly persuade themselves. And that self-persuasion can often be more powerful than any persuasion that you might be engaging in. And I guess it saves you a little bit of effort too. But if you can set them up for that situation of being open to self-persuasion, Ashley, I think that is a nice way to approach that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Dominic had asked, there seems to be a lot of pushback and backlash on the kinds of important things you've raised, even in laws and policies, as well as education. Oh, yes. How do you suggest we try to react to those types of reactions and legal moves to return us to past inequalities, or to return us to inequalities past? Yes. I think a lot of what I had said to Ashley would still continue to apply here. I think sometimes, so some people look at me and they're like, you're a social justice warrior. And I'm like, I don't see how that's a bad thing. But one thing I have learned about being a social justice warrior, I cannot convince the other side using the same arguments I would use with other social justice warriors. That's just not going to work, because they are thinking about the world differently. They're approaching the problem differently. So trying to understand where they're coming from. For instance, I was talking with my mom once, this was 5-6 years ago, I don't remember. It was when the bathrooms were just such a major issue in the news, and allowing transgender students to use the bathroom that aligned with their actual gender, the idea of allowing transgender women in a women's bathroom, and people were just so concerned. And my mom, I was talking with her about it, and she's like, I'm worried. She's got almost all granddaughters. She's like, I just don't want any of my granddaughters to be in danger. And I looked at her, I'm like, what if one of your granddaughters turns out to be a transgender boy? And he just wants to use the bathroom, the men's bathroom, like any other man. And he has to face being beat up or killed just for trying to use the bathroom. And my mom was like, I never thought about it that way. That's a good point. So I was trying to understand why are you so resistant to having gender inclusive bathrooms? And I think her concern was coming from a good place, fear for her own granddaughters. And then trying to say, okay, if that's your motivation, how can I make this message about you and protecting your grandchildren? And that gave her at least an opening. I'm not saying I've totally changed her mind on all issues transgender, but at least it gave us an opening to say, oh, yeah, I would want my transgender grandchild to be safe, just as much as I would want my cisgender or any of my grandchildren to be safe. One place I have found some ability to kind of push back against that resistance and backlash that you brought up, Dominic, is in terms of talking about restrictiveness. So I brought up at the end the idea that, gender, and frankly, a lot of our social categories, not just gender, but it seems predominant, I would say, with gender as well as to some degree sexual orientation. It creates a lot of restrictions for any one of us. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't like being told I can't do something. I have a very strong reactance tendency that if I'm told I can't do something, I'm going to go ahead and do it anyhow and prove to you that you're wrong. And talking oftentimes to people who are more conservative in terms of how they want to think about gender and saying, do you like having these restrictions on you? Like, they don't, like, people don't like being restricted. So again, trying to frame it in a way that might be more palatable to them, that might be oriented to their values and not our own values. This is where I've sometimes talked with my students. I feel fear that some of my students come into my class thinking multicultural awareness is just about protecting each other's feelings. And I actually disagree. Sure, you probably should try and take care of people's feelings and try not to be totally awful to one another. But I think culture, like cultural issues, I see being culturally sensitive as being a critical thinker. And that's where I can sometimes get people who are a little bit more resistant, who are like, I'm not into the touchy-feely stuff. The world is this simple, it's black and white, it's boy or girl. When they start thinking that, oh, wait a second, this is a critical thinking failure if I'm thinking in terms of false dichotomy, it does, again, kind of give me a pathway to slowly change minds. Tammy had asked, do you think there's a chance that people will be so worried about saying the wrong thing that verbal communication in society may break down even more? Yes and no. I sometimes wonder, I'm like, could verbal communication possibly break down anymore? And I say that aloud and suddenly say, of course it can. Just give it a minute. I see what you're saying. And Tammy, you bring up a really nice point. Being afraid to talk to someone, being afraid that you're going to say the wrong thing, and so you decide not to talk to them at all, is not a solution. That avoidance actually can further the problem, especially if I'm someone who's coming from a more privileged group. So if I'm, for instance, someone who's cisgender, it's really easy for me to avoid talking about gender-related issues, right? Because for the most part, even if I'm a cisgender woman, it's a relatively safe-ish world. I can live pretty comfortably if I don't bring up gender-related topics with people. But then I become part of the problem. I become that silent individual that's just kind of nodding at jokes that are putting down non-cisgender folks or putting down any oppressed, marginalized group. I'm just like, ha, ha, ha. And when I'm not saying anything, I'm implicitly accepting and approving someone else's behavior. So do I sometimes worry I'm going to say the wrong thing? Constantly. I'm actually usually just anticipating I'm going to say something absolutely ridiculous. Be ready to apologize. So when you've said something and someone calls you out and says, look, that was not the best thing to say, know that it's okay to say, I'm sorry. Does not make you a bad person to apologize. In fact, I would argue it makes you a pretty decent person to apologize. And try to understand the situation. Don't try to excuse your behaviors. Don't try and go back and say, well, I didn't mean it that way. I'm sorry if you got hurt. We don't need to make all of these exceptions. Say, I'm sorry. Thank you for explaining to me what I did wrong. I'm going to work on that. So, I've been in the situation where I've accidentally misgendered someone. I have apologized. I've tried to publicly apologize in many of those situations to model that for students. But I've also really tried to use it as an educational moment for me and my students, of saying, okay, sometimes I'm going to make mistakes. Only human, we all screw up from time to time. And we can use those moments to learn and grow from them and try to avoid making those same mistakes in the future. And hopefully giving people a chance to learn from our mistakes so that they don't have to make those same mistakes. So hopefully, Tammy, that kind of addressed your question. I do hope that verbal communication or any communication doesn't break down any further. We don't need that. Any other questions, thoughts, concerns?
Randy, can you point me into like a direction of something to read or that has good visuals that kind of demonstrate the differences in the genetic makeup? I heard some things about that yesterday, and I think it's fascinating because I love genetics. So where is like a good resource to go for that? And you could think about it, send it to me later.
Yeah, I'll have to think about that. I don't have any like great go-to. I got to admit, like biology, I have one slide here about biology because I think it's worth acknowledging that people connect gender to biology. Hey, I'm sorry to any of my biology folks out there. I struggled in biology in high school. I struggled in biology in college. It was never my thing. It was an irony when I stepped in to teach a biopsychology class for a colleague last fall. Because I'm probably the last person you'd think to drop into this class. There's definitely some resources I've come across One of the things I've definitely noticed that I think is worth noting for the XXX, the XXY, and the XYY, in most cases, it seems like in the medical field, they refer to them as conditions as compared to disorders. And I think that language is actually really important to appreciate. Even the fact that in the medical field, they refer to intersex as a disorder, I think is kind of concerning. A condition suggests that, look, this is just not what we would normally expect, but it is what it is. And this person is living their best life as best they can, like anyone else. Disorder really does have a lot of connotation that goes behind it. From the perspective of the field of psychology, we use the 4 Ds when we're talking about disorder. So disorders are something that are deviant, so they break from the norm, which intersex in this case would meet that D, but they are dysfunctional. So it creates a problem for typical or expected functioning. And usually depending upon the situation, intersex just does not tend to meet that dysfunction D criteria. There is distress, which we really, again, don't see that with intersex. In fact, I would suggest the distress from being intersex comes more from the prejudice and oppression you experience, or potentially the intervention that someone else imposed upon you. I think that's where the distress would come from, not from being intersex. And the idea of danger, that disorder causes the person who has it some level of harm. And again, with intersex, we really don't see that. So it is kind of interesting that we use the word disorder there, but we use condition when we're talking about some of those is the cases of having 3 chromosomes. I can't remember with the 4 chromosomes, they might use disorder and not condition, because there are some other symptoms or problems that tend to go along with having 4 sex chromosomes instead of 2 or 3. But yeah, I'll look into that, Tammy, and get some stuff back to you.
Okay, just because I'm wondering, in the case of, like, say, Down syndrome, that's a disorder. I mean, it meets that criteria. No one has a choice to have Down syndrome or not. And so this is just to kind of argue the fact that sometimes our gender is not a choice. There is a genetic factor in some of this. And so I'm curious about, some of that. And most people might not know that what their genetic makeup is, as far as if they have XXY or, some of those things. So I just think it's fascinating.
Yeah.
And that's more of these genetic tests, or, ancestry.com, all of those things to kind of see what our genetic makeup is.
That's where the genetic connection is interesting. And again, like historically, it would have been tied to that, but it's not that gender adequately or accurately conveys any
Correct.
genetic makeup. But I like your point, Tammy, about when we see something as biologically based, we are more likely to say that someone didn't have a choice over it. And that can be both a good thing and a bad thing, because when they didn't have a choice, we're like, oh, well, they're broken, we can fix them. And these are the words we use to talk about people who have biological conditions. But when they have something that's seen as more psychological, we're more prone to say, oh, it's just a choice. They're just saying they're transgender or gender fluid. They don't actually mean it. It's just all in their head. And I'm like, well, no, that's just not how any of this actually works.
Right.
Sometimes being that authentic self is not coming from our genes or anywhere in our biology. It's just who we are. And it's us trying to find that authentic self.
Yes.
But yes, I will look into that.
Interesting. Thank you. I have to run. I have another appointment at 1. Thank you so much.
I think there's one more question in the chat. If Randy, do you have time to?
Yep, I was going to put up to make sure I have I missed the chat.
So Rachel Finley said, I work at the Grumbacher and we have about 100 student employees. We issue staff polos that are manufactured as men's and women's, in which men's are larger and looser and women's are smaller and more form-fitting. What suggestions do you have about how we ask our student employees what type of shirt they want without making any assumptions about them?
I like the point of just asking them, saying, I think you said Rachel. Rachel, we could have a whole conversation about what clothing tells us about how we treat men versus women, or masculine versus feminine in this society. So I think it's a really interesting kind of question. The simple answer would be, yeah, just ask, never assume, kind of give them that option and say, look, these are the options we have. And sometimes explaining to students, I feel like a lot of them probably are aware, especially, I mean, if they've been buying clothing for themselves at all, like they're aware of some of the different cuts that you would have if you're buying from the traditional men's section as compared to the traditional women's section. But saying, look, you have some of the options so that you're aware. The women's cuts tend to be a little bit more form-fitting. If you want something that's form-fitting, the men's cuts tend to be a little bit looser and run a little bit bigger in size. So if you typically be a small in women's, maybe get something bigger. So allowing them to make those choices. That's a really good question. And I think that's a nice opportunity to, again, allow people to tell us who they are rather than us making assumptions about them. So the more we can do that and allow people to be their authentic self around us, that's going to be how we can create kind of more gender inclusivity, whether it's through our languages or just our small actions. Well, thank you again for all for listening. If you have any further questions, I believe I have my email up on the page if you wanted to quick take that down or catch me at some point on campus. So thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much, Randy. Tomorrow we have perspectives on gender and culture, why it's not so easy to define woman, presented by Dr. Dennis Weiss. So we hope you'll join us all. Everyone, if you're available, join us for that as well, and have a good afternoon.